All right. Okay, so I was kind of talking about, how like our modern day media sort of amplifies some of these effects. And speaking of media, I also wanted to take just a little bit of time to talk about, various findings within social psych on how media also affects our behavior. So one of the biggest ones, this one might be obvious, something maybe all of you know about. I know it's something I hear about constantly, but I don't know if that's just like my Google and YouTube algorithms, like trained because I'm, interested in psychology stuff. But all of us obviously probably use social media. How many of you have, are active on some kind of social media? Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, Reddit, any of it? Okay. So almost, especially people of your age, a lot of social media usage. And again, you might already know this, might be beating a dead horse, but use of social media tends to be correlated with things like reduced self-esteem and reduced body image. So people who use social media more frequently, like the more that you use it, the more you have these effects of reduced self-esteem and body image. It also can increase rates of depression and anxiety, particularly in, like younger participants, basically, or younger people who are using social media applications. And one of the suggestions of why this happens is because people, when they're on social media, they're making these comparisons between their own life, their own self, and what they see in social media. And obviously what people put on social media is going to be heavily curated. Most people are only going to post, the really positive aspects of their lives, the times when they're out having fun, doing great, amazing things, traveling, eating great food, out with their friends or whatever. So if you're scrolling through social media and you're seeing what all your friends are doing or all these other people are doing, you're getting a very, very narrow perspective of those people's lives. They're not going to post the times that, they're just sitting around in their pajamas doing nothing. They're not going to post the times probably that they're, upset or fighting or, any of those negative things. So as we scroll through social media, we make all these comparisons, comparing our own lives to these very curated, narrow versions of other people's lives. Whenever we make those kinds of comparisons, it's called upwards comparison. So upwards comparison is where you're comparing your situation to someone who is in a better situation than yourself, basically. So if you're sitting on the couch bored and you see someone post a story where they're out in Italy, traveling, eating food or whatever, you're making an upwards comparison in that case. There is some research that shows that if you spend more time doing downwards comparison, so downwards comparison is where you're comparing yourself to someone who is worse off than you. So you might have, a friend. I know a lot of you are in high school still, so maybe this doesn't work very well. But I know people my age at least, sometimes, will get on Facebook or Instagram or whatever and look at people that they went to high school with years ago. And they might see, oh, that person I went to high school with that was really popular and seemed like they were really great. Now their life doesn't seem so great anymore. And I'm way better off than they are. And so in those cases, when you're making downwards comparisons, that can actually boost your self-esteem or your body image and actually kind of reduce rates of depression and anxiety. So a little bit of it depends on how social media is being used. In addition, if social media is being used more for educational purposes, you also don't see these effects of reduced self-esteem and body image. So, for me on my Instagram, it's mostly National Geographic or paintings and art and things like that. Not necessarily following other people as much necessarily. So social media usage can have lots of negative effects depending on how it's used. Any questions or comments about that? Okay. I feel like that's one of those things that probably everybody knows, but doesn't necessarily do anything about it, right? We all kind of know, yeah, being on social media is bad. Maybe I shouldn't spend so much time. But I'm bored, so I'm going to scroll through my social media anyways. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about is this concept of violent media and the effects that it can have on aggression. So this is one area that's still, I would say, fairly controversial. There's some debate about the actual effect and the, extent of the effect. But a lot of that controversy is not necessarily borne out in the actual research. So, basically the question here is if you engage with violent media, particularly violent video games tend to get a lot of the focus. then does that increase a person's rate of aggression? So that's the question we're trying to answer here. If you just like Google this topic and you read, blogs and articles or whatever, you're probably going to see a lot of controversy. You're going to see some headlines that say like, no, it doesn't cause aggression. Other headlines that say, yeah, it definitely does. And people like debating and arguing. But if you go to the actual like social psych research in peer-reviewed journals, you're going to find that there isn't that much controversy, that it's actually pretty much settled that, yeah, in fact, engaging with violent media does tend to increase rates of aggression. The issue is that it's nuanced and complex. And so anytime you have a nuanced, complex subject and media tries to report that in headlines, it's going to get distilled down to something that's way overly simplified. So we do know from the research, violent media definitely does increase rates of aggression. However, kind of the nuance comes from the fact that it's just one of several risk factors. So most of the research, what it suggests is that if a child in particular spends a huge amount of time playing lots of very violent video games, then that is going to be one risk factor that's going to contribute to their instances of aggression. But there's lots of other things that can impact aggression as well, obviously, right? If that child is being physically abused in their home, if they're being bullied, if they have, certain genetic factors even, those are going to be other risk factors that are also going to contribute to rates of aggression. So violent media, violent video game usage is just one of those risk factors. I will say, though, there's one study in particular that I was reading before class that showed that it was kind of like a longitudinal study where they basically track kids over the course of a whole year. Most of these kids were in like 3rd to 5th grade. And they measured how much violent video games they played, like how many hours they spent playing them, and then also their rates of like physical fights that they got into at school. And they also asked them a bunch of other questions about a lot of those other risk factors that I talked about. And what they found is that if you hold all those other risk factors equal, playing violent video games on like a daily basis doubled the amount of physical fights that those children were getting in. So it has a pretty big effect on aggression, especially in young children. So, again, been shown. Yeah, Alex.
I'm curious if studies compared violent video games to video games in general.
Yes, yeah. So most of the research finds that it's particularly violent video games that lead to aggression, that other types of video games that don't include violence do not lead to aggression. They have found, so one of the questions that's often asked is like, does the realism of the violence matter? And from what I can remember from what I read, it doesn't really matter. Even if you have like really cartoony blood and cartoony figures, that still increases rates of aggression pretty much just as much as like really realistic violence in video games. Yeah.
Isn't that mostly inverse in regards to like society as a whole, like the start of the video games in general, like, geeky, people that were generally bullied, didn't get in fights, even though games at the time were actually fairly violent.
I think I'm following what you're so you're saying that in general, especially in the past, the people who played video games would have been like geeky kids.
Yes.
And that those geeky kids wouldn't have been necessarily aggressive.
Yes.
Is that kind of what you're saying? I haven't read anything like that makes sense to me on an intuitive level, just based on kind of like stereotypes of, nerdy kids in the past, but I haven't read anything that corroborates that with like scientific evidence. So I don't know. And especially, most of the research that I've looked at on this, I would say takes place like post 2000, even like 2010 and later. So I feel like, from like 2000s on, video games are much more accessible to a wider range of people. There's not necessarily more that like stereotype that you're thinking of like it's just the geeky kids playing video games. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's more broad. So I get kind of the logic that you're thinking through, but I don't think it fits like the data that's published. Yeah.
How recent is the most recent studies on that?
There's some stuff that I was looking at that was published like 2020. So I would guess a lot of this research probably stopped during COVID, and so there probably hasn't been a ton in the last 2 years, but yeah. I think this particular study I was thinking of with the longitudinal thing was like 2007 maybe, so that one's a little older. But yeah, there's very recent research that supports this idea. One of the big researchers that you can look into if you want to look at specifics, there's a team One of the guys is Douglas Gentile, and the other one is Craig Anderson. So if you want to look up research, those would be the two to look at. There's another one that does, so, you know, I mean, with anything, you're going to get some debate and some controversy, some people who agree and disagree. I would say, like, the consensus, if you look at the majority of research in this area, you're going to find a lot of it supports this idea. There is one researcher I can think of, his name's Ferguson, I can't remember the exact spelling. I want to say it's that, but there might be another R in there, and I can't remember his first name, that has more research that suggests that, you know, that violent video games does not cause aggression. But a lot of these researchers have, like, you know, kind of attacked his research and basically said, like, here's all the flaws in this research of why he found that. So there's kind of a debate between them, basically. So if you're interested, if you really want to dig into the details and see, like, for yourself, you know, what are the findings, I would say look up those researchers. Yeah. Anything else?
I see video games as an outlet just the same as you know, punching back. You know,
There's research too that suggests that if you there used to be this idea, right, that like if you feel aggression, then you can take it out, and if you take it out on, you know, punching a pillow or something, then at least you're not taking it out on a person, and then, like, you know, that's going to reduce violence. But it actually turns out that if you sort of give in to those impulses of punching anything, then that can actually increase aggression over time. So using it as an outlet isn't necessarily going to reduce aggression, it might increase it. And then I'll also say, I mean, again, keep in mind this is one of several risk factors. There are tons of people who can play violent video games and are never going to be violent or do something violent in their lives. I play a decent amount of video games. I don't play a lot of violent ones, but my husband does. My son plays some that are kind of violent. So I don't think, like, none of these researchers would say, violent video games should be banned and no one should be allowed to play them. They would never go that far. It's more just like, we should acknowledge that this could increase rates of aggression. So if you have a kid who has a bunch of those other risk factors, right? If you have a kid who's being, abused at home or, all these other things, then maybe for that kid, taking away violent video games might be a good idea because you don't want to pile on risk factors. Right, but if you have someone who's had a very well-adjusted childhood, who doesn't have any of those other risk factors, playing violent video games even on a daily basis is probably not going to be it's not going to increase rates of aggression, especially in adults, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions about violent media and aggression?
I guess one thing is that you mentioned that one study was causing fights.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we determine that it's not that the people with more aggressive tendencies or those factors are more inclined towards violent media?
Yes, yeah.
As opposed to the other way around.
Yeah, that's a great question because a lot of this study, just the nature of the question, it is correlational in the design. So you're looking at a correlation of these people who play lots of video games also happen to be more aggressive. There are actual experiments that show a more short-term effect, okay. Right? So they've done experiments where they'll have people come in and they'll have half their participants play like Tetris or some video game that's obviously not violent at all. They'll have the other half play some violent video game. And then they'll, one example I can think of, they do that and then they have a Confederate in the hallway that bumps into every participant as they come out. Makes it look like kind of an accident, like I bumped into you. And they find that the people who were just playing the violent video game are much more likely to respond to that aggressively, to either yell at the person or push them, to confront them, whereas the people who were playing like Tetris or whatever are less likely to do that. So that's very short term. It's not like that effect is then going to last and that person is going to go out and do something super violent. But yeah, there's some experimental evidence that's very short term, basically. Great questions. Any others? Okay. What are we at on time? 9:40? Okay, we'll keep going.